Folks, you're with Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about some of the great speeches of all time, and there have been some great stirring speeches that we've got on, in modern history at least, that we've got on film and recorded, and whether we're looking at some of Theodore Roosevelt's speeches, Franklin Roosevelt's speeches in the fireside chat type stuff in the 1930s and 40s, Winston Churchill's stirring speeches, John Kennedy's speeches, and other lesser known politicians at local level have obviously had great speechwriters. I guess in earlier times, the politician may have written their own speech or part of it. One of the interesting things about Richard Nixon, as an example, is that he had speechwriters, but he would often very substantially edit the speeches, or even write most of it himself, or write the bones of it out and have somebody sort of tidy it up a little bit to get the proper pauses and get the cadence sort of all lined up. But John Kennedy had a very good speechwriter. But when we look at the speeches themselves, they connect with us emotionally and use phrases that have no definition. For example, say Ronald Reagan, just looking at a more recent sort of president. He did some or had some very stirring speeches written for him. And it was well rehearsed. I mean, he was a former actor, and I remember there's one speech that I remember that I thought at the time was quite stirring, where he said in stirring and emphatic tones with suitable amount of gravitas, "And to the enemies of freedom, to the enemies of freedom." Now, what a great phrase that is. I mean, enemy of freedom, enemy, freedom, all in one. To the enemies of freedom, we will stand up. And this is, oh, wow, enemies of freedom. Yeah, enemy. Oh, fuck yeah, the enemies of freedom. Go get those motherfuckers. And it's got a certain sort of emotional resonance. But what does it mean? What enemies? What freedoms are you speaking of exactly? And I mean, this was directed against, in the Cold War days, against the Soviet Union. So it was more of a sort of a metaphor, I suppose. But this is stirring stuff, and you kind of somehow you just know what it means. Enemy, you know what that means. Freedom, you know what that means. And it brings up visions of, and very much part of American folklore, the idea of the people rising up against the evil oppression and fighting back and bringing justice to the world and that sort of stuff. So teaching those oppressors, kicking their ass and sending them home. So the emotional resonance is very much part of it. And then go further back to President John Kennedy's speeches, and he made some pretty good speeches on the campaign trail, and he delivered them very well. He delivered them with that sort of authority and confidence that only a shitload of media training can give you. And Kennedy certainly had that, courtesy of his very rich folks. But I remember, I think it was the inauguration speech, and listening to or watching the newsreel type stuff, years later. It's just to give you some context here, that there was a lot of claims around at the time that the Democrats were soft on communists, and the speech that Kennedy was making were sort of designed to dispel that. And so one of the great lines in the speech was, we will bear any burden, we will oppose any foe, and making it very, very clear that America and that the president was committed to, fighting the incursions of the Red Menace, as it would have been seen at the time. And it is a very reassuring speech. But I thought, even if you look back at it now, there's something about the delivery, the cadence, the tone. Obviously, he rehearsed the crap out of it, but delivered with, and it was something that was very reassuring. you're being looked out for and looked. We will make sure that the bad guys don't come. If they do come, they're going to get such a kicked ass. That type of thing. And it's sort of a part of the infantilizing thing that there's the monster under the bed or the monster in the closet, but your parents tell you, well, I'm not going to let that monster get you, and you go, oh, thank goodness for that, and the kid goes to bed at night and sleeps soundly. It's that same sort of reassuring tone thing. But it was a great speech. But when you analyze it, say, what does that mean? Oppose any foe and bear any burden. What the fuck does that mean? It sounds good. It makes me feel good in the gut. It gives me that good feeling in the gut. But what does it mean? Let's break this down. And really, the great speeches are connections. They're nowhere near reality, or they've got no definitions involved there. There's no details. And if you're making a great speech, you can't get caught up in the weeds of facts and definitions. I mean, whether a speech is good or not, what happens if you come out saying, and employment's fallen from 5.1 to 4.856%, which is a reduction in the amount of unemployed, and black people have got this, and people have tuned out after the first couple of facts. It's just too much to digest. But an emotional feeling, sort of something that delivers an emotion that they can connect with, and that's really the basis of a great speech, the soaring rhetoric. Now look at Winston Churchill's speech. Now Churchill was something of a wordsmith. He's probably one of the world's most prominent wordsmiths of the day, and was reflected in his numerous writings and numerous speeches. When he didn't have time to sit down and craft a speech and practice it and rehearse it, then he wasn't so good. He was rather unimpressive. But when he had the time to put it together and craft it and deliver it and practice it and engage in many days of rehearsals, when he had that, then it was a pretty good outcome. But even so, the great speeches that he's remembered for are these broad statements that have no definition and where all reality was gone. For example, the speech that was this is. We Will Fight on the Beach's speech, which was heralded as one of his great speeches or stirring speeches. Now, just to sort of give the background, the armies of the Wehrmacht, the Nazi armies, had sort of absolutely trounced the British and French armies in France. Had just swept them aside or obliterated them with what seems like astonishing ease. And nor were they numerically superior. Nor were they particularly superior in any equipment or materiel, like say tanks and a little bit superior in aircraft. But they were just much better trained, better organised, much clearer objectives. They were fitter soldiers and so on. So they won. They trounced the French and the British in 1940 there. And the British had evacuated quite a lot of their army, along with some French and others, to Britain. The Dunkirk evacuations, but they'd had to leave, vast, nearly all, but certainly the heavier material, the artillery, the trucks, the so on, which was the most of what Britain had at the time. Was left there. Now the British looked at their industry and thought, there's no fucking way we can replace what we've lost. It'll take us many months to replace what we've lost. And there was a tendency at the time to put more of those resources into the Air Force, which on its own was really no match for the Luftwaffe at the time. I mean, they did make good to some extent on that, but so Britain's in a bad state. Army's been defeated. The Wehrmacht, the Nazi armies are in control of the entire European coastline. They're in control of Denmark and Norway. Submarines are running around everywhere you look. So Britain's in a not a very good place. So the political sort of discussion at the time was, we're fucked. We better cut a deal with Hitler. Hitler was offering very, very magnanimous terms that treated Britain as an equal rather than as a defeated foe. And some even today say that Britain was pretty dumb to fight on, given there was no possibility they could win. And it was only by America's entry into the war that the tables were turned there. But so Churchill was made prime minister, but his position was shaky. So he needed to get the populace behind him, and then that would sort of, if you like, the body politic would fall in line and turn behind Churchill if he got the public on side. So he made a series of speeches, and that we will fight on the beaches, we will fight on the landing grounds, we will never let our island home be invaded, and we'll never surrender, and da. Now that was all hot air. The reality was, if the Wehrmacht had even got at the time, even if they put a decent parachute drop in there, they could have probably have taken Britain at the time. There's a view, even by Britain's own military, and certainly by military analysts since, if the Wehrmacht had even got sort of 20,000 soldiers, equipped soldiers and given that the British Armed Forces, their morale was rock bottom at the time, if even they could have got 20,000 soldiers in there, say parachute drops and submarine deliveries at night or whatever, getting there, they would have they could have pretty much taken over. The British would have gone down like a deck of cards had the Wehrmacht got people in there. But again, a relatively small number of soldiers in there. There just wasn't any cohesion or ability to coordinate any decent response. And once they had a bridgehead, they could the Wehrmacht. Once they had a bridgehead, they could have brought over other soldiers and or other troops and support equipment and so on. It would have been a risky business for the Wehrmacht, and it would have been wouldn't have looked good on the nightly news to find that their 20,000 troops were stranded without supplies, for example. That wouldn't have worked so well. But I would suspect if they'd done that, they would have won and would have prevailed pretty quickly. Nonetheless, Churchill's speech, "We'll fight on landing grounds" and so on, even though it bore no reality, the reality was that they were screwed. The reality was that the government was very shaky, and half of them were on wanting to make terms with Hitler, so that speech was really just hot air. It was bravado. It was it was bluff. That's all it was. But it goes down as a great speech. Now we can look at other speeches. When Nelson Mandela became president of South Africa, he tried to emulate Martin Luther King, where he was dreaming of a society where everybody would, in South Africa, where everybody would be equal and everybody would have equal opportunities and everybody would have equal access to goods and services and education and so on. In fact, it's gone the complete opposite. White people are being cruelly discriminated against in South Africa. The governing black elite is corrupt as fuck, and they're destroying the whole place. And riots and crime are just everywhere. Blacks rioting and shooting each other and so on. So now Mandela had been around long enough to know that his speech was purely aspirational. It bore no reality to any of the realities that existed on the ground. And he must have known it was going to. Maybe he wished for something different. It was going to turn into he must have known the likelihood of any sort of nirvana appearing there, other than a black elite enriching themselves. Any chance of that would have been very, very slim indeed. But he made the speech. It's heralded as a great speech. I think it's nonsense. I don't think it's a great speech. I think it's only a great speech in terms of the globalist activists and that sort of thing. But its aspirations were fine, I suppose. But its connection to any reality was just non-existent. Now there are other speeches like Theodore Roosevelt's speech about the boss system, which Woodrow Wilson touched on as well, President Woodrow Wilson. But Theodore Roosevelt was saying there's a lot of monopolists and other criminals that are sort of ripping off the society, and we need to put an end to that. And I thought that speech, not as grand perhaps, and not as sentimental, but I thought that speech came closest to being a great speech, but couched in reality. And there's not many speeches can achieve that. And I think Theodore Roosevelt's speeches, or some of them anyway, did achieve that. So I cite those speeches as great, not only in that they connected emotionally with people, but they talked about real issues, real remedies, and and realities that not only existed, but in outcomes that were achievable in a realistic sort of appraisal and assessment of things. That's a difficult thing to do in a speech, because again, once you go into facts, it's very easy to get caught up in the weeds, and then you don't get that opportunity to deliver the grand sentiments. So when we look at the great speeches well, most of the speeches are written by people other than the politicians. They're mostly rehearsed and practiced deliveries, not natural. And the majority of them have only express sentimental emotions rather than deal with any realities. I think, therefore, they fail as great speeches, given they're devoid, or too devoid, or utterly devoid in some cases, of any reality. Now, it may give you that stirring feeling in the gut when you're young and naive. As you get older, you look at it, well, that sounds good, but it's bullshit. And that's a different appraisal. I think that older people have been around a bit longer, mate. Does that mean there's no room for the grand speech? No, I think grand speeches have their place. And I prefer that the politician would write them and actually mean it, rather than just say, well, what have I got to say to get elected? And that in turn further detracts from these grand speeches. But when we look at grand speeches and we look at the closeness to any sort of reality and practicality, then really there's hardly any stand up to that test. Only a few. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.